What's up, everyone? JJ here with yet another late round podcast rewind. The episode that you're going to hear today was somewhat of a teaser episode for another episode that I did on the tight end position, but there was still some actionable info in it. It still made sense for me to bring this episode back as a rewind. Now, as you can tell by the title, it's on tight end streaming. And on the episode, I share some tight end streaming results that I've documented through the years, and I explain why the position, even though you're starting just one of them in a typical fantasy league, I explain why the position isn't as similar as you might think to the quarterback position. Late round tight ends emerge all the time, but selecting one with an early round pick makes a lot more sense than selecting a quarterback with an early round pick. And this quick episode explains that in some detail. As always, I'll be back in your ears later this week with a mailbag episode. Enjoy. So let's talk about tight end streaming. Some of the concepts today are going to sound familiar because I talked through a lot of them last year on an evergreen episode about tight ends, about the tight end position. So no, you're not hearing some repurposed podcast. There's new information here, but it's building off of what I talked about last year. Now, a lot of you guys know this, and you definitely know it if you listen to the quarterback streaming episode, but I've got another podcast called Living the Stream. It's a much different podcast than this one, but it is about fantasy football. On the show, my co-host Denny Carter and I give streaming recommendations each week for quarterback, tight end, and defense. And we've kept track of those recommendations for the past 5 years at quarterback and the last 4 at tight end and defense. As I noted with quarterbacks, we're usually in the QB6 to QB8 range with our streaming Frankenstein. But that's without the benefit of finding a quarterback and holding on to him for the entire season. You can do that in your league. We can't do that with our recommendations. We're going by players who are generally owned in less than a quarter of leagues when we make our recommendations. So if you had Deshaun Watson off your waiver wire during his rookie year, you had him longer than we could hypothetically recommend him because his ownership went through the roof after he broke out. So keep that in mind. It's important to keep that in mind. Let's get to the tight end streaming results. Like I said, we tracked our tight end results over the last 4 years. And we've averaged 10.4 PPR points per game in 2015, 9.5 in 2016, 12.2 in 2017, and 8.9 last year. Aside from 2017, that's nothing all that special. 2015 equated to the tight end 13, 2016 was about the tight end 16, 2017 was actually awesome at tight end 4, and then 2018 was tight end 16. Maybe you're now thinking, wow, these guys are complete frauds. But here's the thing. Tight end is a lot different than quarterback, especially late in the season. It's a lot harder to find usable players in weeks 11, 12, 13, when there are only a handful of guys getting consistent targets in their offenses. In other words, quarterback usability is always there. Tight end usability is not. If you actually look at the later round tight ends who outproduced their ADP the most over this 4-year span, a lot of those guys were recommended on the podcast. Like, I love George Kittle last year. And Jared Cook was a week 1 streamer last season on Living the Stream. Had you just gotten Jared Cook, you would have had the tight end 5 and 12.1 PPR points per game last season. Instead, our streamer looks like Jared Cook with one leg with its 8.9 points per game average. I'm not trying to make excuses for some of the bad picks that we made. We made bad picks. That's going to happen. But we need to be real with how the tight end position works. Volume is scarce at the position, so most teams are going to be looking for that player once the season gets underway. At quarterback, every team is going to feel pretty good about who they have at their quarterback spot. What I think the results show you is that only tight end streaming, never finding a tight end that you can really rely on for a stretch of time, that's risky. You may not have the best roster in the world if you do it. However, we have to remember that you're not spending anything in order to put that Frankenstein together. If we average out how our tight end streamers have done, you're looking at a low-end tight end 1. And if you remove that tight end 4 season that we had because it does look like an outlier, we've got a high-end tight end 2. That's not necessarily ideal. It's not awful, but it's not ideal. Now, the reason tight end streaming is more difficult than quarterback streaming, it has to do with supply and demand for sure. There are far more usable quarterbacks available each week. But what plays into that is predictability. As I've said in the show before, you can look at predictability in 2 different ways, from a weekly standpoint and from a yearly one. At the weekly level, we're really asking how predictable was this single performance. And to help with that, we've got a statistic called the coefficient of variation, or CV, which is a data set's standard deviation divided by its mean. Since a data set with a larger standard deviation may be skewed by larger numbers, like quarterbacks scoring more points and therefore having a larger standard deviation, dividing by the mean allows you to compare across data sets. In this case, across positions. You can compare quarterback to running back to wide receiver to tight end. If you measure the CV for positional groups, so QB1 to QB6 or RB1 to RB12, for instance, you can compare and contrast the predictability or the true variability of each group. To keep this short and sweet as possible, what I found is that quarterback has the lowest CV, or it shows the least amount of variability. That naturally makes it more predictable. Tight ends are generally pretty unpredictable on a weekly level, except at the top tier. This is actually one of the advantages that you get when having an elite tight end that's not talked about enough. It's not just the point differential advantage that you would likely get with a player like that, with a Travis Kelce, but it's having a more predictable asset at an unpredictable position. But here's the thing. You have to ask yourself, who are these predictable assets? In other words, how do we secure one of those elite tight ends in order to have that advantage? The obvious go-to answer to this would be to just draft one early, but it's not so simple. Historically, if you look at the correlation between where tight end 1 through tight end 12 has been drafted and how many season-long points they've produced, there's almost no correlation. Since 2011, we've seen an R-squared of 0.04 among tight end 1 through tight end 12 and how they finished. That's lower than what we get from running backs and wide receivers. Now, what that hypothetically tells us is that there's not a lot of difference between the tight end 12 and the tight end 1 when entering the season. And the reason for that is because we see breakout tight ends in the late rounds all the freaking time. You had George Kittle last year, though he was actually tight end 14, so not really part of this sample. But you had George Kittle last year. You've had guys like Eifert, Jordan Reed, Eric Ebron. The list goes on. And at the top, we've had some busts. I think we have to recognize that Rob Gronkowski didn't live up to his ADP every single season. There's a reason his average cost got lower and lower every year after really blowing up. And Jimmy Graham laid some eggs too. The real problem here, though, and this is something I talked through at length in the Evergreen tight end episode last year, but the middle rounds have been historically dreadful for tight ends. They've been awful. Tight end like 4 through 9 has historically sucked. There hasn't been that big of a difference between those guys and the lower tiered players, and that's dragging this correlation down. This is what caused me to say last season that tight end is generally a position where you either spend up or you just wait. So here's where we're at right now. I know I'm just kind of throwing stuff at you, so let's just recap. Having an elite tight end can give you some sort of predictability advantage, and that's a good thing. That's on top of the point scored advantage that he's already providing. You don't always have to spend to get that player, though. You'll likely have a better time finding that guy in the early rounds, but later round tight ends hit at a pretty decent rate within the context of the position. But digging even deeper than that, unlike quarterback, your safety blanket isn't exactly the same with tight end. It's harder to stream the position. It's more difficult to find usable pieces on the waiver wire. So to these specific points, it may seem like getting Travis Kelce, getting Zach Ertz, getting George Kittle, that making that choice is logical. That spending at tight end makes a lot of sense. And that's what we call a teaser. Next week, I'm going to be talking to Rich Rebar about this position and whether or not getting those elite tight ends is worth the cost. That's going to do it, though, for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. I know it was a short one, but if you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And if you're on iTunes, please do me a favor and leave a rating and review. You can also follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back in your ears later this week with a mailbag episode.